Welcome to the Mouth of Richland podcast. Thanks for joining us today. For more information about our church, find us on Facebook and Instagram at Mouth of Richland Baptist Church. Remember, this podcast is not to replace your weekly church attendance, but should be supplemental to your walk with Christ. Today's sermon is from our senior pastor, Nick Wright.
Man, what a great day this is to celebrate 231 years of being a body of believers here at Mouth of Richland. What an honor it is to be one of your pastors today and be in a long line of historically great pastors and part of this church. And I pray that Brad and I can live up to the type of men that Jim shared about earlier, and what a cool story that was. Today, I want to preach a sermon entitled Built on the Rock, as you can see there, for 231 years. And one of my first sermons that I ever preached about here at Mouth of Richland was about Joshua leading the Israelites across the Jordan River. And he gave them two instructions. The first one was for the priests to build an altar of rocks in the Jordan River, to signify that is where God allowed them to cross, to where that anyone that came by would look there, see the rocks, and know that is where God allowed the Israelites to cross the Jordan. It was a symbol of God's great work that He did there through the Israelites. But He also told them to take rocks with them, to carry rocks around. And when people asked, and when their children many years later said, "Mom, Dad, what is this rock?" And they would say, "This is from the day that God allowed us to cross the Jordan River on dry land." And it was a wonderful symbol of the work that God had done. And I think it's fitting that in the New Testament, Jesus refers to the church as the rock. And Jesus is the rock that the church is built upon. And I think that Mouth of Richland has been a solid rock for 231 years in the community of Blaine and in the county of Granger County. We are the oldest church in Granger County and the 18th oldest church in the state of Tennessee. What a testimony that is to many years of a solid foundation. And I can tell you that the only reason that this church has been allowed to persevere, to succeed, to have ups and downs, but to always come back up is because we've always found our way back to the true rock, which is Jesus Christ. And we have based this church on Jesus Christ, who is the rock of our salvation and of our faith. And when I was preaching the sermon about Joshua, I said I think we had 40 or 50 people in the congregation that day, a lot of empty spaces in the parking lot, and I said, one of these days, we're going to start building rocks outside of this church. We're going to start putting rocks out there because people are going to drive by and they're going to see the parking spaces filled. They're going to hear that the pews are filled, and they're going to know that God's at work at Mouth of Richland. And so for a year now, we've had a chance to go to work and build some rocks. And I'd like to share today about some of the things that we've been able to do only because Jesus Christ has blessed us. And I want to preface it by saying this is not a chance for Brad and I to brag about our jobs here, and it's not your chance as a congregation to brag. This is our chance to brag on Jesus and what He's done this past year. And I'm going to embarrass some people, but Emily Shelton here, would you care to stand up and show everybody your shirt real quick? Turn around there where they can see it. You see what that shirt says? Raised to Life. And that is our baptism shirt that Emily was baptized in along with one of her daughters and 12 other people that we baptized back in July. So not only have we seen people baptized, but in the past year we've had 15 or so baptized or saved here at Mouth of Richland Baptist Church, which is just an amazing thing. We've had 50 plus people join this body of believers. We've had new ministries start. We've had Bible release time through Joppa Elementary School. We've had a children's church that you saw is in full swing. We've had a student ministry that when we got here, I think we had one student, and now we're averaging anywhere from 12 to 15 on Wednesday nights, so praise the Lord for that. We've averaging around 100 people in worship attendance. We've started 2 new Sunday school classes. We've had events of community outreach where we've went and witnessed to people at Food City. We've had people come here for our Sermon on the Mount. We've went to Eastland Apartments and had a block party for our Vacation Bible School. And then Wednesday we're going and having a trunk or treat there at Eastland Apartments. So we have done a lot of great things for the name of Jesus Christ this past year. And like I said, this is not me telling you how great you are or I am. This is me telling you how great Jesus is. To take this group of people and make us effective for His name, because for Him to do that with me is a feat in itself. I'm 25 years old, don't know anything. And for me to lead you all to halfway success would have been a miracle. But for us to have the kind of success that we've had, it's not me. It's Jesus working through me. Because there's no way that I was the reason that this happened. But all of the things that I've listed are yet just another chapter of the long list of Mouth of Richland Baptist Church achievements as a body of believers. As Brad and I have been here, we've been told that throughout the past 100 years or so, this church has just been focused on missions. They've sent teams to South Carolina and Florida and North Carolina when there were hurricanes, and they built houses for people. They took up money for those people. This past year, we gave upwards around $10,000 to disaster relief and to various offerings. But this church has always had a legacy of helping people for the cause of Christ, and I'm thankful that that's what it was built upon, because we have been able to continue great, great things. But, like I just said, our focus must be on Jesus Christ and His work of building His church. And if you look there in Matthew chapter 16, verse 18, Jesus makes it very clear. Peter confesses that Jesus is the Christ. We'll start there in verse 16. He says, Simon Peter answered and said, You are the Christ, the Son of the living God. And Jesus answered and said to him, Blessed are you, Simon Bar-Jonah, for flesh and blood has not revealed this to you, but my Father who is in heaven. And I also say to you that you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of Hades shall not prevail against it. And I will give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven, and whatever you bind on earth you will bind in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth you will be loosed in heaven. Then he commanded his disciples that they should tell no one that he was Jesus the Christ. What's interesting here is many people take this passage to say that Peter is the rock. And in fact, the Catholics take it so serious that they worship Peter as the rock. But as you look at the original language here, when Jesus says, You are Peter, and on this rock I'll build the church, the name Peter means rock, but when Jesus says, On the rock I'll build the church, that's 2 different words. Jesus uses 2 different words, and in our translations we don't necessarily catch that. But he tells Peter, you're going to be called rock, and you're a little rock. And Jesus says, but there's a big rock that you're going to build the church on. And who's the big rock? Jesus is the big rock. And it's clear throughout the rest of the New Testament that Jesus is the big rock. He is the foundation of the church, and we are but little rocks that get to rest on the foundation. So I wanted to look at some of the scriptural uses of rocks and stones in the Bible. The words that are used to describe rocks and stone in the Old Testament and in the New Testament, they describe God's name as rock. They describe God's character as a rock, which meaning He is stable, He has strength, He is everlasting. And in 1 Corinthians, we are told that Paul uses Jesus Christ, he describes Him as the rock in the Old Testament. And in 1 Peter chapter 2, we are called, the Greek word is lithos, which means stones, which means that we are little pieces cut off of the big rock, which is pretty cool to think about, that as Christians, Jesus is the big rock and we're little shavings of who He is. That's an interesting way to think about it. But in the Old Testament, there's a Hebrew word called salah, which means a big rock or a cliff or strength and stability. But there's another word used for rock, but it's always capitalized, and it is Sur, and it means large rock, and it is the name of God that is used in the Old Testament. But now let's look at a couple of the positive and the negative ways that rocks are used, which is pretty interesting because they describe God a lot, but there's also a lot of negative uses for rocks in the Old Testament. You didn't know you was going to get a geology lesson here today. Is that the right word? Geology? Yeah. Not geography, but geology. Rocks are used in positive and negative ways. Let me just list here. Positive. Creation itself is of the rocks. The earth is a rock. There are stone altars built to God in the Old Testament. In Exodus and in Numbers, there was a rock that was struck that was used to give water to the Israelites so that they would not thirst to death. In the Old Testament, the Ten Commandments and God's law are written on stone or rock tablets. They build the temple out of rocks and of other types of rocks. When they crossed the Jordan, as I spoke of earlier, they built rock altars in the Jordan and they carried them around with them. David killed Goliath with a rock. In Daniel, we're told that Jesus is going to destroy all the earthly kingdoms as the stone cut without hands. We're told that Peter is the rock that will begin the church and that Christ is the rock that is the foundation of the church. And probably most importantly, there was a rock that had to be rolled away to reveal our risen Lord. But there's also some negative uses of the word rock. Many say that Cain killed Abel with a rock. It actually doesn't say what he killed him with, but a lot of people imagine that's what it was. We are told that the disciples, that Pharaoh, other people throughout the Bible harden their hearts of stone. Stones are used to stone people, to execute them when they are in sin. Jesus Christ is referred to as the stone rejected by men. Jesus also tells us that the rocks will cry out if we don't worship Him. The rock that was used to give the Israelites water in the wilderness was struck twice, and it shouldn't have been. And Moses did not get to enter the promised land because of that. And many times the church is referred to as a rock that causes people to stumble. So it's interesting that we have both positive and negative effects of the rocks. But what's very interesting is that the positive effects are all God's doing, right? He created the world. He was the stone that gave water. He gave the Ten Commandments. He crossed the Jordan. He allowed them to cross the Jordan. He's the one that allowed David to kill Goliath. He was the stone that's cut without hands. But all the negative ones are when we mess up His creation. Cain killing Abel. We harden our hearts. We have to stone people because they break God's law. The world rejected Jesus Christ, so He is known as the stone rejected by men. The rocks have to cry out because people don't worship God. And we ourselves too many times are stumbling blocks that cause people to stumble. So the negative is always because of people's sin, and the positive is always because of God's greatness. But I want to look, and I've got a few minutes here to look at this one instance of a positive and a negative way. I want you to turn to Exodus 17. We're going to look at one of these that I just mentioned. Whoops. Exodus 17. This is what it says. This is the Israelites out in the wilderness, and they are looking for water. Then all the congregation of Israel set out on their journey from the wilderness of Sin according to the commandment of the Lord, and was camped at Rephidim. But there was no water for the people to drink. Therefore the people contended with Moses and said, "Give us water that we may drink." So Moses said to them, "Why do you contend with me? Why do you tempt the Lord?" And the people thirsted there for water. And the people complained against Moses and said, "Why is it that you brought us up out of Egypt to kill us and our children and our livestock with thirst?" So Moses cried out to the Lord, saying, "What shall I do with this people? They are almost ready to stone me." And the Lord said to Moses, "Go on before the people, and take with you some of the elders of Israel. Also take in your hand your rod, which you struck the river, and go. Behold, I will stand before you there on the rock in Horeb, and you shall strike the rock, and water will come out of it, that the people may drink." And Moses did so in the sight of the elders of Israel. So he called the name of the place Massah and Meribah, because of the contention of the children of Israel, because they tempted the Lord, saying, "Is the Lord among us or not?" So what's interesting here is that God has miraculously rescued the children of Israel. They've just seen Him do these wonderful things, and they're out in the wilderness for just a little while, and they get a little thirsty, and they start to freak out and lose all faith in God. They're like, "We're going to thirst to death. You know, you've brought us out here to die. We're never going to make it." And if I'd have been Moses, I'd been like, "Did you not just see Him part the Red Sea and let us walk across and then kill the Egyptians that were behind us? Like, come on, you know, have a little bit of faith." But they did have somewhat of a reason to think about where their drink was going to come from, because they'd not seen a rock produce water, so there was somewhat of a reason for them to worry. But God told Moses to provide the water by striking a rock with His staff, and it provided water and life to the people. We're told in 1 Corinthians chapter 10 that Paul says that this rock is a picture of Jesus, that the rock was struck and He gave up water for us to live on. And Paul says that's a representation of Jesus Christ. And if you think about it, when the rock was struck with a staff or a rod is normally a representation of judgment. So Christ being struck with judgment, and what flowed? Water flowed. And what is Jesus Christ? He is the water of life. And what flowed on the cross out of His side? Blood and water. So even in the Old Testament, we have a picture of Jesus Christ giving His life for His people, and that life flows out of Him, and it is there for us to partake of. Jesus gave Himself up for us that we may be part of Him and His church. And we have to see this as a great honor to be a part of His rock, to be a part of His foundation, and be recipients of His life-giving power. But that's a positive way that rocks were used. Flip over to Numbers chapter 20. We're going to look at a negative way that the rocks were used. So starting in verse number 1. The children of Israel, the whole congregation, came into the wilderness of Zin in the first month, and the people stayed in Kadesh, and Miriam died there and was buried there. Now there was no water for the congregation, so they gathered together against Moses and Aaron. People contended with Moses and spoke, saying, "If we only had died when our brethren died before the Lord, why have you brought us up, the assembly of the Lord, into the wilderness, that we and our animals should die here? And why have you made us come up out of Egypt to bring us to this evil place? Is it not a place of grain, or figs, or vines, or pomegranates, nor is there any water to drink?" So Moses and Aaron went from the presence of the assembly to the door of the tabernacle of meeting, and they fell on their faces, and the glory of the Lord appeared to them. Then the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, "Take the rod, you and your brother Aaron, gather the congregation together, and speak to the rock before their eyes, and it will yield its water. Thus you shall bring water for them out of the rock, and give drink to the congregation and their animals." So Moses took the rod from before the Lord, as he commanded him. And Moses and Aaron gathered the assembly together before the rock, and he said to them, "Hear now, you rebels, must we bring water for you out of this rock?" Then Moses lifted his hand and struck the rock twice with his rod, and water came out abundantly, and the congregation and their animals drank. Then the Lord spoke to Moses and Aaron, "Because you did not believe me to hallow me in the eyes of the children of Israel, therefore you shall not bring this assembly into the land which I have given them." This was the water of Meribah, because the children of Israel contended with the Lord, and He was hallowed among them. So we see one time Moses comes up to this rock. God tells him to strike it. He hits it, and water flows. And Paul says that's a beautiful picture of Christ being sacrificed for us. Then we see this second time they come to this rock, and God tells him to do what to it? To speak to it. That's interesting. But we see here Moses gets angry, and he says, do we have to hit this rock to bring water for you rebels? And he, whack, hits it again. And we're told later that because he did that, he was not allowed to enter the promised land. And if you think about it, Paul says that this rock is a picture of Christ. And how many times did Christ have to endure judgment? One time. And when Moses struck him twice, he shouldn't have done that. Christ didn't need to die twice. Christ didn't need to endure judgment twice. He didn't need to suffer twice. He needed to do it once. And as a matter of fact, God told Moses, he goes, don't hit it, speak to it. Which is a picture that after Christ suffered and bought our freedom from sin, there is no judgment for you or for Christ. That our relationship is open, that we can simply speak to the Lord. He indwells within us, and we can just simply talk with Him and ask for forgiveness and for life instead of Him having to suffer for it. Christ gave Himself up for the church once to be sacrificed that is sufficient for all time. And there was a correct way for Moses to handle it the second time, and there was an incorrect way for Moses to handle this and relate to Jesus. And this time he handled it incorrectly. The little rock handled the big rock incorrectly. And you may be wondering, where are you going with this? Why are you saying all this? We're little rocks here today. And we're sitting in a big rock. We're sitting in God's house, sitting in a congregation that is based on Jesus Christ. And I want to ask you today, how are you treating Christ? How are you relating to Christ? Are you being obedient to God, speaking to Him, or are you abusing His forgiveness, His love? Are you living in sin? Are you living in rebellion? Or are you enjoying the rock that gives life? Are you treating the rock that gives life correctly? Because what's interesting here is that, and I was puzzled on this, why did God tell Moses to take the staff if He didn't intend for him to use it the second time? He specifically said, take the rod with you, but He did not want him to use it. Was it a test? Was it what was it? I think that it was a sign that judgment was being withheld on both accounts. Judgment was there, but it's being withheld. God says, you don't use judgment this time because judgment's already been appeased. Judgment's already been satisfied. Christ died once for all the sins, and judgment is always there, but Christ withholds it from us in our everyday walk with Him. And so I want to challenge us today. How are we relating to Christ, the big rock, as we are little rocks? How are we treating Him and His church? Today is all about celebrating us as a church of 231 years. And the only reason this church has done so well is because we've treated Christ right for 231 years. And I want to challenge us today to continue to do it. To continue to be obedient. That even when we get angry and we want to strike the rock, speak to the rock. When it's so easy to disobey and rebel and revolt, speak to the rock. Be obedient. And trust in the big rock. And realize that we are nothing but stones. Little shavings, little pebbles that just look like the big rock. And I'm okay with that. I don't know if you are. I'm okay with just being a little pebble that looks like Jesus. That's good enough with me. Stand with me if you will.
This concludes our podcast. For more information, find us on Facebook and Instagram. See you next week.